Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about the specifics of why the entertainment industries, or at the very least subsections of the entertainment industry, will never turn themselves around. Because there are some people who still hold out hope that, for example, the comic industry will come back to some kind of sanity, that they will eventually come to a realization that they must provide a product of merit and will then begin to provide that product once again. Now, I'm going to make that argument in a very roundabout way. Why? Because you can make this simple argument and just say, well, it's never going to turn around because it's headed by people who are villainous, people who are the opposite of what I'm always talking about. I'm always talking about the virtuous hero. And these people are vice ridden villains. They're evil. Sure, you could just put it in that one dimension, but to understand villainy in the way that it's being practiced is something completely different and helps so much more. Number one, it helps me because explaining it does help me write and understand what a motivation for a villain actually is. And two, we need to stop taking the people who are around us today and who are doing evil things and reducing them to one dimensional villains, like they were twirling their mustache. Why? Because if we don't understand the root reasons and the specifics of those reasons that they are doing what they're doing, they're simply going to do it again if they have the chance. And they will have the ability to do it again because we haven't gotten rid of their ability to do so because we just painted them as one dimensional villains. But of course, before I get there, I just want to remind everyone that there are two links in the description and the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels. They are stories about true virtuous heroes. There are 2 superhero graphic novels and 1 return to form for low fantasy sword and sorcery, and you're looking at some of the beautiful art from those graphic novels in the background. And oh, by the way, people are starting to get their copies of the Valiant Heroes, and I'd be very interested to hear what people have to say about it. So drop me a line or tag me on Twitter. My handle is also in the description for Twitter in case you want to know. And it doesn't matter what you have to say, good, bad, ugly. I will take criticism as constructive criticism. So anyway, you can still get a copy of that book. The link for it is in the description if you want it. Again, shipping right now. And if any of my books appeal to you at all, then click on one of those links in the description or the pinned comment and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. All right, so I'm eventually going to get to the point where I talk about why these industries simply will not turn around. Again, it's because they're acting in a villainous way. But first, we have to understand that villainy and understand their commitment to the vice, which is the opposite of the virtues, which drives them to be this way. And quite honestly, I think a really good example of the kind of villain that they are is Magneto. And I suppose this is a good time to talk about Magneto, anyways, because if you don't know who he is from the comics or from the previous X-Men movies, you're going to know pretty soon because of the new X-Men movies that are going to be coming out within the next couple of years. So this is, to some extent, a little bit of a character study of Magneto, really. Although I'm not going to talk too much about the character specifically, although I'll probably put images of the character in the background. All right, so the origin of really the villainy that we see around us today comes from a very odd place. And the odd place is the fact that these people, these vice ridden people, these vicious people, claim to be serving the greater good. I'm sure you probably heard these quote unquote progressive people claiming their service of the greater good at one point or another. And if you haven't, we'll just know that their claim that they serve social justice is also a claim that they serve the greater good. And just like social justice in itself is not a bad thing, we could go back to Cicero in the Roman Empire talking about the common weal. And it's basically the same thing, but he talks about it in a rational and logical way, wherein social justice is only possible first with service to individual justice. But these current social justice people, the way they use it is to obliterate individual justice, and therefore what they're trying to portray as social justice isn't social justice at all. The same thing happens with their claim for the greater good. There is a reason to claim service to the greater good, but these people are corrupting that claim so much so that they are serving anything but the greater good. Now, I want to get into the philosophical and, quite honestly, the theological template for the greater good. And that comes from Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. And the reason why I want to focus on his description of the greater good? Well, there's several reasons, but I think one of the prominent reasons is that it has ingrained itself so much in our way of thinking that it's actually become a part of storytelling. And you will recognize this trope from storytelling because you have seen it over and over again. Oh, I suppose I should mention before I get there that some people might think that the best way to talk about the greater good would be to talk about war and a just war, but that's a much too complicated subject in order to bring up. And too complicated for two very specific reasons that I can think of that are connected with what we have to talk about today. Because the situation in war can change and develop, but it changes and develops through the acts of will. Whereas we can talk about the greater good not just as acts of will, but as acts concerned with other things that change and develop. And I'll get into that in a couple of minutes. But secondly, it's because the way that people think about the greater good and war is not the way that modern society actually thinks about war. Most people don't understand this. I have several degrees in political science, taken several courses on the politics of war. And why does that matter a hill of beans? Well, it matters a hill of beans because the people who take political science usually do so because they want to become lawyers, and those lawyers then go on to become judges and or politicians. So yeah, it has a great influence on the way people think about things in our society and how it's run. But the thing is that modern descriptions and ways of dealing with war have absolutely nothing to do with any kind of value judgment. There is no consideration whatsoever of whether or not it's good or not. Now, they will sell it to people. The government will sell it to people as this is a just war. We're doing right here. But their consideration in itself has absolutely zero to do with value judgment. The way that modern politics deals with war is completely utilitarian. They think of it completely as simply an arm of diplomacy. It's a very simple calculation. You have two sides. Those two sides, two countries, want different things. When they come into conflict with what they want, they use diplomacy. But when that diplomacy fails, the ultimate extension of that diplomacy is simply war. It's inevitable. It's going to happen at some point. There's zero value judgment about it whatsoever. The way that it is, that is to say, war is dealt with and thought about in modern politics, again, is that it is simply an extension of diplomacy. Zero value judgment attached to it at all. So again, that's why I'm not going to talk about war specifically as the example, but it will play a part in what I have to say. Anyways, let's move into Thomas Aquinas's example of the greater good, which again, you'll be familiar with when I get to the end of this. And I'll freely admit right here, I'm going to embellish a little bit just because I am a storyteller. And we're talking about this in terms of story, of course. Thomas Aquinas was a medieval, so we're talking about things in medieval terms. Let's say you have a medieval city-state that is centered around a castle. Now, you go to war with your neighbor. Your neighbor sends an army against your castle, and you send out your army to defend your castle. Now, your army gets completely obliterated on the battlefield, and the enemy army is charging full steam ahead at your castle. What do you do? Well, the only good option that you have left to you in the immediate, because again, this is happening, they're charging right towards your doors. The only good open to you is to close the doors of your castle and secure it as much as possible, as quickly as possible, so they can't get in. That's the good open to you. Now, I should state here that Thomas Aquinas is giving a logical proof of the entire thing and then giving an example of the logical proof, which means, as a logical proof, there are no external factors that he doesn't mention. If he doesn't mention it, it doesn't factor into the argument. So I'm sure you could come up with a whole bunch of what if this, what if that, but it doesn't matter because it's not part of the logical argument. That being said, he himself then takes the situation and adds a different factor to it. So take the exact same situation, and instead of your army getting completely obliterated on the battlefield, they get routed. So your army is in retreat, and they have, at the very least, a hope of getting back to your castle and getting back to security before the enemy runs them down and before the enemy gets to your castle. Now, here's where the greater good comes in. And by the way, this is the storytelling element that you've seen over and over again. People running back towards the doors before they're closed, before the enemy gets there. And the reason why it's such a good storytelling trope is because it involves a moral dilemma. Because you're afraid of the enemy and that they might get there first, do you close those doors right away and condemn the people on the battlefield to their death? Or if you hold them open, how long do you hold them open? This is all part of the moral dilemma, and this is all part of what he describes as the greater good. So, in his first example, when your army was completely defeated and the enemy was charging toward your castle, the only action that you have left for you is to close those doors and to wait even a moment. To close those doors would be you committing an act of evil. There is no way, again, logical argument, so there is no way that you can do anything besides close those doors for your security and the security of your people. So delaying even a moment would be nothing more than an evil act. There is no reason to do so. There is no claim of good to do so. That is to say, to wait even a moment. However, if your army is, in the second example, routed and they are fleeing back toward your castle and have at the very least a hope of getting there first, then there is a greater good at play. In the first example, leaving those doors open even for a moment would be wrong, would be you committing an evil act. But in the second example, since there is a greater good at play, since your soldiers could get back to your castle before you close those doors, then in that moment, holding those doors open is service to the greater good. Not only for the utilitarian reason that if those soldiers get back, they can help provide a greater defense of your city, but also because, really, morally, their lives have worth. And if there is even a hope that you can help preserve those lives, then yeah, you hold those doors open. But the real question and the real moral dilemma that we have to deal with here is, how long do you hold those doors open? Well, of course, it's all based upon the hope that these people can get back into that castle. So you need to use your virtue of prudence and determine whether or not, or I guess I should say, when that hope is ultimately lost, and then you have to close those doors. Now, here's the part which most people gloss over about this entire argument and don't even give consideration to. Number one, as I said, it's a logical argument, so there's no external factors entering into this argument itself. Number two, as a logical argument, it occurs within the present tense. If you go back to the Greek and the Latin, it would be present indicative active, if I do remember correctly. But these two factors are very significant. Why? Because here's the thing. It doesn't admit to the fact that you have any opportunity to think besides dealing with the immediate problem, nor does it provide the opportunity for you to do anything else with this situation. And that's an important point, because if you were given even a moment to think and come up with a better solution to this problem, and you continue to hold those doors open, guess what? You're no longer serving the greater good. That example of the greater good only works in the here and now, the immediate, where this is the only thing that you can be concerned with. When you have the ability to enter into that entire scenario, again, a secondary factor wherein you're given a moment to consider doing something else and the opportunity to do something else in this entire situation, the entire moral compass of the situation itself flips 180 degrees. Because, as I said, in the first example, if you hold those doors open, you do evil. But in the second example, if you hold those doors open, which is the exact same physical action, you're serving the greater good. Therefore, since immediate time and limitations are part of the definition of this greater good, once you can enter external factors into it which allow you to do something else, then that greater good no longer becomes simply not the greater good, but you have to realize that it doesn't lessen it from the greater good to, let's say, a lesser good, or from the greater good to a neutral. No, it reduces it from the greater good to evil. Now, at this point, I want to give you a bit of a personal example of this entire thing, and a more immediate one that some of you might be able to connect with. In 2020, when the Kung flu hit and people started claiming we're doing all of this for the greater good, what was my first reaction? Well, here's what happened and here's what I did. For a long time, after that entire thing started. After about 2 weeks, I started to argue with someone who I considered in a very prominent position, someone who had taken moral philosophy and theology classes, and we would spend minimum 1 hour to about 3 hours a week for 6 to 8 months. We argued about this entire situation. And his argument was it's service to the greater good. And my argument was no, I'm sorry. This is not in service to the greater good. Why? Well, I brought up the example that I just gave you from Thomas Aquinas. I said, with the first 2 weeks of this entire thing, sure, I could be on board with some of what they had to do, but it didn't really affect me because I live in the middle of nowhere. But here was my point. I said, after 2 weeks, they no longer were in that immediate situation. They had other options available to them. They had the breathing room in order to consider those other options. And oh, by the way, this is not war. You cannot claim it's war or that it's like war. Why? Because within war, as I said, your enemy has a free will in order to act, and they can do some pretty unpredictable things. I would say in this situation, yes, you have a quote unquote enemy that can adapt and change, but it can't adapt and change according to free will. Therefore, it's only according to science, it's according to predictable, rational, and logical things, so you can sit down and take that moment of extra thought and come up with a better strategy. But they failed to do so. And not only did they fail to do so, they deliberately ignored any of those external factors that were being shouted from the rooftops that could prove that they're not in service to the greater good. And once that happened, I said, after those 2 weeks, when they were given that opportunity, no, they're not in service to the greater good anymore. And I would extend that condemnation not just to the government, but to religious leaders and to your neighbor. Doesn't matter. They're not following the greater good. They're doing something evil. And my talks with this fellow, my discussions with this fellow on this entire thing finally broke down when we got to a point where I said, look, I do know something about childhood development. It's one of the things that I'm actually pretty well versed in. And I said to him, can't you see that what they are doing right now is going to cause irreparable harm to the youngest people in our society? Can't you see that this evil action is occurring because of this entire thing? And he agreed with me. He said, yes, I can see that that is happening right now, and that is what is going to be the result, but we're still in service to the greater good. And I went, nope, done. Not talking about this anymore. Because if you can admit that this evil is happening, you have to admit, again, we're a Christian culture, so you have to admit, evil fruit comes from an evil tree. You cannot get good fruit from an evil tree. So I said, no, if you admit that that is what is happening right now, that that evil fruit is occurring because of this, then you have to admit that the root that it's coming from is evil, and therefore, no, they're not in service to the greater good. Now, I'm going to leave that all to the side for a moment, but we'll come back to some of that in a minute or two. Let's for a moment look at Magneto, because Magneto is very much a product of this moral dilemma. Yes, at one point he was a one-dimensional villain, but he became something more over time. And it involves several things that I've been talking about. As a character, what does he do? Well, he says there is an inevitable war that is going to happen between human beings and mutants. To him, there is no question about it. It is inevitable. And he himself is claiming that he serves the greater good. He thinks of himself as the hero. Why does he think about himself as the hero? Or at the very least, as the savior, because he thinks of himself sort of as the savior of mutant kind. And why does Professor Xavier and his X-Men think of themselves as the heroes in opposition to Magneto? Well, it's because Professor Xavier presents the moral dilemma, whereas Magneto looks at this war in utilitarian terms. Magneto doesn't believe there is any other future option besides war. Professor Xavier says, no, 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 no. We have free will. We can make decisions that will lead us to a place other than war. And since we can use our consideration in order to figure out what those external forces might be that lead us to something other than war, then you, Magneto, you do not serve the greater good. Your example that war is inevitable is not rational. Therefore, your claim to serve the greater good that will eventually be the future of mankind is actually evil that makes you the villain. And funny enough, This is the distinction within what most people would consider those one dimensional comic book stories that shows you the definition of a hero. Magneto is a representative of the modern way of thinking about war, which our governments use. But Professor Xavier is going back to a moral dilemma. He's considering the moral in this entire thing, which again, if you want to be a hero, you got to go back to the virtues, and those virtues are moral things. That's why his side, at the very least, up until, the last 15 years, was the heroic side. Now let's take all of that and impose it upon the situations we see around us today, and in particular, the situations with the entertainment industry, and see why these people will never turn around. First off, we have to look at the fact that these quote unquote progressive people are in the same situation as Magneto. Whereas Magneto sees war as being inevitable, your quote unquote progressive people see the progressive end of history, the progressive utopia, as inevitable. Because, of course, you have to realize that this quote unquote progressive ideology draws its origin from no other place besides Marxist philosophy. Really, Marxist ideology. The Marxist ideology that, yes, we are progressing towards an end of history. That's what progressivism is all about, the progression towards the end of history, wherein there will be a heaven on earth, wherein there will be a utopia, a Star Trek-like future, at the very least. And, oh, by the way, this is not a logical or rational claim in any way. And yet, they believe it so wholeheartedly that, just like Magneto, who thinks that war is inevitable, they will say this entire thing, this progressive future, is inevitable. And at the same time, they use that as a crutch to support their claim that they serve the greater good. And everything that they do is in service to the greater good. Why? Because that greater good is the Star Trek-like utopian future, which is inevitable, and they're helping bring it about. And the point is, they use that claim of the inevitability of this future utopia to support their claim of service to the greater good, because it allows them to claim the ability to sidestep any of the objections brought against their actions. Just like Magneto says, no, I don't need to consider any of those other options because they're not even on the table, because this is inevitable. This is what they themselves, these quote unquote progressive people, do. They say, no, you can bring all of these arguments against what we're doing over and over again. We're not going to listen to any of them. Why? Because what we're trying to bring about is simply inevitable. We're just trying to bring it about in a quicker way. Again, just like Magneto. Now, here's where things get a little bit muddled, but they are purposefully muddled in this particular area. Just like Magneto, these quote unquote progressive people keep others occupied who are in their castle from considering any external factors by saying, look, the enemy is coming. Look, there's the enemy. They're bearing down on us. Keep your focus on the enemy. Because, yes, you do have a moment where you can consider other options. And there are other options out there, but they want to keep you purposefully distracted on the enemy so that you don't have a moment to consider any of those options. Because if you had a moment to consider any of those options, you will see that this is no longer the greater good you are in service of. No, what you're actually doing is evil. This, by the way, is one of the tricks, one of the essential tricks of your quote unquote progressive movement. And yes, it does even go back into liberalism before that. It's to blame everything on the enemy. It's never to look inside. It's always to have an enemy to use as a scapegoat. This is actually the history of the entire liberal movement. Liberalism's first enemy was conservatism. When they defeated that, then they began to infight and say, no, this form of liberalism is no longer any good. That's our enemy. First it was the anarchists, then it was the fascists, then it was the communists. But they needed to keep the normal people's focus on the enemy so they couldn't consider any other options. And this is why, by the way, the best way to defeat your quote unquote progressive ideology is, as most people say, simply give them what they want. If they don't have an enemy to blame anymore, then people begin to think. And really, this is the reason why we find ourselves in this situation to begin with, because I can remember studying political science back in the late 90s, early 2000s, where you had these major political science academics writing paper after paper after paper saying communism has now fallen with the fall of the USSR. Therefore, there is no enemy left. Everything will simply become a liberal democracy now. So, in short, they swallowed their own Kool-Aid and decided, no, we don't need that enemy anymore. We have one. And then people began to wake up and say, I'm looking at this situation right now and going, I don't think I want that either. What you're giving me? No. I don't want that. Let's go back to something more simple, something more conservative. And that's, of course, why we find ourselves in this situation today. They started to panic and say, we need a new enemy. And that new enemy became males, whites, Christians, because they had to try to restoke, to rekindle that furnace within people of distraction through concentration on the enemy, so those people can't think. But here's the problem. We already started to think. A good portion of the population, at the very least 50%, if not more, have woken up to the fact that they have been distracted by concentrating on the enemy for so long, no matter what that enemy was, that they weren't allowed to consider any other options. But now, we not only, or at the very least half of us, are not only in the position where we're beginning to consider other options, but we can see, first of all, that we were distracted from considering other options before, and we have back-to-back considerations of the two different ways of dealing with things within, well, not just US politics, but within politics around the world. You have governments really playing out the same thing that is happening within America. You had this person, Donald Trump, coming into the White House, and they claim, no, he's the enemy. He's doing everything wrong. We must defeat him. And then they defeated him and supposedly reintroduced all the things that they wanted to do. And people are looking at it going, no, something's not right here. All of those things that you said would go away if we focused on this enemy and defeated them, they didn't go away. They actually got worse. So this is people waking up to the fact that not only have things gotten worse, but it seems to be that this evil fruit is coming from an evil tree. That these things that you claim to be doing are not actually good. And we literally have 4 years of one way and then 4 years of another way to compare within recent memory to actually make these considerations. And since those stark differences are in our face right now, every time you look at your grocery bill, we realized, we have time to consider other options. And if we have time to consider other options, then no, your claim of service to the greater good no longer holds. And if your claim for service to the greater good no longer holds, it takes your actions, which you claim are for the greater good, and put them in the exact opposite position. And we can see that they're not only not in service of the greater good, they're not in service of any good. They're actually evil. You're holding the doors open specifically for the enemy to get in. And this holds true, by the way, equally for the political as well as for entertainment. Why? Because both of those things are based upon trust. If we go back to Aristotle, 4th century BC, his logical description of what a story is, he says it's a reflection of reality. And one of the key factors within that reflection of reality is the fact that you must have a trust between your reader and the person telling the story. Because it's not actually reality, but you have to engender trust enough in them so that they can engage what we now call a suspension of disbelief in order to trust that this is, for the immediate moment, like a logical argument, what is actually real. And it is only through that trust that you can engage that suspension of disbelief. And it is only through that suspension of disbelief that you can get engrossed in the story. And it is only through that entire mechanism that story actually works in the way, logically and rationally, that it is supposed to work. So if that trust is not there, then the people who are telling the story cannot tell a story anymore, because you simply do not trust them. And if these people who run these entertainment industries were to do a 180, they would have to admit not only that, yes, they were doing something that in normal times would be considered evil, but they were purposefully doing it, willfully doing it, knowing that it was evil. Now they make that claim because, again, they're claiming service to the greater good, but you have access to the knowledge that, wait a second, you could have done something else. You could have done this in a better way. You had other options open to you that obliterates their claim of the greater good. And most of us are already at that realization point. Then they're turning around 180 degrees to say we need to serve merit now is a claim that they were purposefully and willingly deceiving you and that they were doing wrong. And in addition to that, that they A, either knew exactly that they were doing wrong, or B, purposefully ignored all of the external factors and conditions that were presenting themselves to them that showed them they were doing something wrong, that showed them they were doing evil. And no, I have no qualms about calling it evil. Looking at some of the things these people have been trying to promote, especially to young children, yeah, I call it evil. So they're stuck in a bit of a catch-22. If they continue on the course that they have set for themselves over the last couple of years, they will destroy the industries within which they operate. But if they do 180 degrees and turn around completely and admit their entire culpability and fault within what has happened over the last couple of years, they lose their ability for their audience to trust them in any way, shape, or form, which will then cause the destruction of their industry. Because really, who but the most naive is going to trust someone who says, yeah, I lied to you for years and years, purposefully, willingly, maliciously, but I turned over a new leaf now, come and buy my product. So, since they are stuck in this catch-22, where they're going to destroy their industry no matter what they do, and of course, they are self-avowed, quote-unquote, progressive people, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to service their ideology first among any options that they have. Because we have to stop for 1 second and admit that their entire course of action up until this point was going to destroy the industry anyways. As quote-unquote progressives, they saw these entertainment industries as being, oh, for the comic industry, a part of misogynistic culture anyways, therefore it had to be destroyed. Or at the very least, it had to be turned into something completely different than it was actually previously, that it is de facto destroyed. So destruction was part of their plan to begin with. This is not something that they were unprepared for, and since, again, they're faced with these options that is going to lead to destruction, they pick the one that is going to service what they've serviced up until this point, which is their ideology. Or to put it another way, as I said in my previous videos over the last 2 weeks, these people live in a shame culture, not a guilt culture. Therefore, they have to save face. Because if they turn 180 degrees around and produce something of merit, they would have to condemn what they have done previously. And here's the thing, if they condemn what they did previously, they also have to condemn progressivism, but they're not going to do that. Indeed, not doing that and allowing their industry to die a slow and painful death is actually in service to them. Why? Because they can use that industry then as a scapegoat. They can claim that it was the industry's fault and place all of their sins on this industry, because that's what a scapegoat historically was. It was an animal that you would place all of your sins on and then drive it out into the wilderness where it would be killed because it's a tame animal in the wild and your sins would die with it. So that's what they're doing with their industries. Sure, they've slowed it down, but that's what they're doing. They're claiming, well, no, it's the industry's problem. That's why you're getting these ridiculous claims, which everybody knows are ridiculous, about why the comic industry is failing. Claims like, well, these 40 to 50-year-olds, which are the people who make up the majority of comic readers, well, they're all starting to die off. What? That makes zero sense. But you get claims like this over and over and over again right now. Why? Because they realize their industry is dying a slow death. They don't care. It's actually in service to them because they're using it as a scapegoat. They're saying, no, this entire thing happened because the industry was the problem. We weren't the problem. Our ideology wasn't the problem. It was the industry that was the problem. Therefore, let it die. Let it be driven out into the wilderness so it can carry our sins away and then die. This is how they can claim that, oh no, that wasn't real socialism. Oh no, that wasn't real communism. Oh no, that wasn't real progressivism. Why? Because this corrupted industry took it over. And if they can make that claim, that's how they can claim in the future that we should do this again. And that's why we need to go through the mental exercise of understanding all the things that I talked about and more. We have to understand the exact and specific reasons why these people are not one-dimensional villains, why they're not just sitting there in the corner twirling their mustache. And we must understand these things so that we can take away their ability to ever claim in the future that their evil actions are in service to the greater good. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all of this. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description for my 3 graphic novels. And, oh, by the way, after I finish speaking, I'm also going to play a 1.5-minute trailer from one of my books so that you can see a little bit more of the story and the art and what the entire thing is about. And then maybe you'll want to click on one of those links in the description and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.
An age ago, the beating heart of our people was a king who knew only victory. He wanted nothing more than an honorable death on the battlefield. Yet, none could match him, and so he wandered the earth, becoming lost in time and tide. Then we too lost our honest purpose, while silk-clad men sat upon the throne. But tremble now, all cities that lay under the stars, for out of the shadows and mists of the land of promise, our courage has been rekindled, our heart has returned, and the world will burn.